This 10 light setup uses all continuous lights, and I'm gonna show you how I use each light, sometimes to get a dark film noir old Hollywood look to a high key fashion look, using a mix of lights from the 40s and 50s to modern day Nanlite LEDs. And yes, we're gonna shoot both stills and video. I'm using Fresnels, spotlights, small scrims, large scrims, and can you tell where I'm hiding the tubes in this scene? I'm also going to go through 8 tips making lighting a set like this a bit easier. You may recognize this set from my previous video on the GFX 100, the second. This is the second video in that series. Tip number 1 of 8, use a mannequin and pre-light. Take a day or hours before your first shot to set up your lighting. Don't make your subject sit through getting all these lights set up. So use a mannequin or an assistant to stand in, then tweak when your subject is in the frame. Now, what will the first light be? For me, it's one light I cannot do without. This Forza 500 with a Fresnel overhead gelled with a Roscoe quarter CTS to warm it past 2700 Kelvin. I'll talk about why I gelled it later. I also moved in a Cupo scrim when I want it to be softer, but sometimes I want it to be hard for a more film noir dramatic look. Here you can see it as my main light, giving me very dramatic light with hard shadows. Here I'm mixing it with flat light to get dimension to this image. And then here it is acting as my rim light. In this wide shot, you can see it during my pre-light setup. Tip number 2, your main light should look good all by itself, and the other lights you add just make everything else better. I believe the first thing you need to learn in lighting is the strength of a well-placed single light source. Okay, now for light number 2. I'm using this Forza 60 with a spotlight attachment to highlight these old tungsten Fresnels so they don't get lost as dark blobs in the scene. I'm using a spotlight on them to keep the light from spilling all over the set. In this shot, you can see how the spotlight on the Fresnels doesn't take your eye away from the subject, but adds a bit more texture to the overall image. Can you find the Nanlite tubes in this shot? Probably not. They are behind the set to give me a light coming from underneath the gravity hand-painted backdrop, to appear as if there's something going on behind our set. They are positioned behind our Fresnel and on the floor to add more contrast to the scene depending on the angle we are at. They are also motivated by the background lights coming through the muslin that I'll talk about later, and make it appear as if the light is behind our entire set. In hindsight, I would have hidden them even further using a roll of diffusion, but when out of focus, they do give me the look overall that I'm going for. The 5th light that I'm using is an actual 2K spotlight from the 50s. At times it acts as an edge or accent light, other times I'm shooting it past our model to flare out the lens. It also makes a great prop in this shot. To get an extra flare, I did add a quarter Pro Mist filter to the lens at times, but let me know if the Pro Mist filter is too much in the comments. Here's the setup without it. And for more control, I'm using a 2K dimmer box. Tip number 3, don't start a fire. Now that I'm using a 2000 watt light, my recommendation is plug it into its own circuit. Most people don't learn about power distribution until they trip a circuit, burn a fuse, melt or overheat an extension cord, or worse, start a fire. Most wall outlets are connected to a 20 or 15 amp circuit. So to know how much load you can put on a circuit, amps times volts equals watts. So my Nanlite 720 pulls 720 watts. So I can put 2 of them on a 15 amp circuit because 15 amps times 120 volts equals 1800 watts. And 2 Nanlite 720s pull a total of 1440 watts. If I added another, it would trip the circuit or power strip. You can check by looking at the circuit breaker connected to the outlet or series of outlets. So now, for a little bit of bad advice. Oftentimes 2K lights get modified with 515 connectors versus 520 connectors. When using a 12 gauge extension cord, 25 feet and under, I have never had an issue other than tripping a circuit. But the moment I use an extension cord higher than 12 gauge, 14, 16, 18, or above 25 feet, I have had issues with the connectors blackening or melting. These old Hollywood 2Ks I'm using draw about 16.7 amps. So in a perfect world, I would plug them into a 20 amp circuit using a 520 connector and only using 10 gauge extension cord, which is rated at 20 amps. But there are levels of danger to this, and I don't recommend you break the rules as I have done for the past 20 years, but I've gotten away with it. And a lot of rental houses you'll find will modify like an RE open face 2K so they can be used on a household circuit. When it comes to extension cords, if you can get away with plugging it directly into the socket versus using an underrated extension cord, I would do that as well. As a 12 gauge extension cord is usually rated for about 1800 watts, nothing above that. And if you really want control over your old 2K, get a 2K dimmer so that you can control the power in relation to the other lights. Now for light number 6. I'm using a 10K Fresnel with a Nanlite Forza 60 inside of it. It doesn't quite fill the large Fresnel like I'd like it to, but it's giving. And the small Nanlite 60C fits in the smallest of places. In hindsight, I may have used 4 to 6 small Nanlite tubes and magnetically stuck them to the metal reflector inside. Yes, sometimes I do think about doing things differently after I've done them the first time. My 7th light that I'm using is an actual 2K Fresnel, probably from the 50s and 60s. At times it acts as an edge or accent light. Other times I would put a scrim in front of it to soften it and use it as my main light depending on where I was positioned on set. Here you can see it uses my main light for this beauty shot and then this full-length portrait. I'm also using a 2K dimmer on it as well to control its intensity. Tip number 3.5. If you love the look of these old 2000 watt lights, but don't want to bother with figuring out electricity, then simply get 1000 watt lights. And the Adorama used department always has these coming in and out of inventory at great prices. My 8th light is a Forza 720 pointed at the back wall and bouncing back into two 10 by 20 foot unbleached muslin backgrounds. This gives me a nice glow to the background. And like the tubes, gives a feeling there is something else going on behind the set, adding a bit more depth. My 9th light on a floor stand gives me more illumination in the back as well. I also have a fan back here to give slight movement to the muslin. So this brings me to tip number 4. When shooting fabrics in a video, it can look nice for subtle movements to add more visual interest to your shots. So use a fan. My 10th light was a Forza 720B from overhead. It gives me a nice overall feel coming through the 12 by 12 full silk and lifts the shadows while also still being very directional. My 11th light was a Forza 500B from camera left to also provide fill. So yes, I'm going over 10 lights like I stated in my title, but if you count the 2 tubes as 1 light, then this is 10. Now back to this Forza 500B. I could have bounced both fill lights from the ceiling, but I wanted the fill light to have more direction. So therefore I placed them a bit lower and aimed them directionally through the silk. So now tip 5 of 8, color temperature. When mixing these old Hollywood 2Ks, they are about 3000 Kelvin at full power. And when dimmed, can go down to 25 to 2700 Kelvin. So using bicolor LEDs is a godsend. So you don't have to gel all these lights. But I still gelled this light to bring its range from 27 to 6500 Kelvin to approximately 25 to 5000 Kelvin, since I was going to be in this very warm range. I probably didn't need to do this, but because the light was up so high, I gelled it just in case I wanted to take advantage of it being a bit warmer later on or throughout the shoot. Tip number 6. A light meter makes it easy during your lighting setup to make sure all your lights are in the same ballpark. It's way easier to tweak later, and it makes remembering what you did during this 10 light setup way easier, trust me. Tip number 7, when shooting both stills and video, set your base exposure based on your video camera's desired ISO, because currently video has less latitude than you have in shooting raw still images, so it guarantees you get a great image. Here is a short video sequence I shot of our model to test out the new GFX. I wasn't sure of its base ISO, but the shot of the model's hand adjusting the fan was 3200 ISO and noise-free. Now for my favorite tip out of all of them, and it involves you. I need you to comment below. Let me know the topics you'd like to see me cover, because quite honestly, I level up every time I hear from you. Your insights, your comments, your feedback from you. Thank you so much. Like, comment, subscribe if you want to see more content like this on Adorama TV. It's definitely a pleasure.